Hi. I hear someone for a second, and then it went out. It went, oh. We are live. I don't hear Heather. So we're trying to get Heather so we can communicate, so we can chat with you. As I stated, this is Debbie with Help for IBS, and we are doing a part 2 to IBS and gluten. There's a lot of misconception about it out there. So Heather's here, our expert, to help us clarify, to help us stay on track when we're dealing with managing IBS and how to be paying attention to gluten. And as far as our IBS, Heather, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, Deb. Can you hear me?
Wonderful. Yes. Welcome to live.
Okay, good.
A live show. Wonderful. So part 2, we got so many response to the gluten and IBS. It was great. I'm so glad people were reaching out with their questions.
Yeah. Lots of confusion on that issue. Lots of questions.
Yes. And so I have pages of questions here. This one, Heather, from Marie, actually does a wonderful sum up. I think you're going to be able to layer upon this one. And I love the fact that she's working through figuring out how to manage. So basically, she writes, I found gluten is a hit and miss in situations. I don't eat dairy because of intolerance and was suggested to eliminate gluten would be a good idea too. But I found that I often reacted poorly to gluten-free flours as a replacement flour, especially from the peas and bean family. Makes me feel worse than if I just stuck to the wheat. Let's see, there's more to it. I found I can tolerate, but in moderation. So she found that white sourdough bread is best of all. She's tried eliminating all breads and most grains in her diets, but found that she misses them from time to time. So what I love about her is that she's figuring out what, of course, works for her body, but she's also responding to, oh, it must be the gluten, but yet she's realizing that it isn't necessarily gluten. She's not diagnosed with celiac, so there's no celiac diagnosis on this. So she's an example of, I think, what a lot of people with IBS, their number one struggle when they're not diagnosed with celiac. So what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, she's right on target. She probably is doing a lot worse with gluten-free flours than she would be with just a plain old white all-purpose flour that has gluten in it. And the fact that she's not reacting to sourdough bread, there's gluten in sourdough bread. So if you have a gluten intolerance, it's not likely to be a hit or miss. Your body is going to react to gluten and by making antibodies to it. Actually, if you have a gluten intolerance, it's an autoimmune disorder. Okay. And you will have a reaction to any amount of gluten. It can be even so negligible that it can just be cross-contamination in cooking equipment if someone truly has celiac.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So if you're doing well with sourdough bread, you don't have a gluten intolerance. That right there is telling you one thing. Okay. The fact that you're not doing well with gluten-free flours that have the pea proteins in them, the galactans, the chickpea flour, that actually does point to IBS because that wouldn't cause any trouble at all to someone who just had a gluten intolerance or celiac. They're not going to have an intolerance to pea proteins.
Okay.
Someone with IBS, you might well have an intolerance to that. That is not surprising. And you have to really watch out. If you need to be both gluten-free and have IBS, you really have to scrutinize labels and don't assume that because something is gluten-free, it's safe for IBS. I would assume the exact opposite. The question to ask is, what are they replacing the gluten with? Because gluten is a key component in a lot of cooking, a lot of baking chemistry. Gluten gives a chew to noodles and to bread crusts. It's a protein. So if you're going to remove that protein from things like breads and pastas, you have to replace it with something or you won't have an edible product. So what kind of protein are they replacing it with? Maybe it's whey, a dairy protein. Maybe it's a pea protein. You really don't know, but it's probably something that's unexpected, that your gut is not used to having in a bread or a pasta, and it may be something that's an IBS trigger. Okay. So gluten-free does not equal IBS safe. And IBS does not equal gluten intolerance. So everybody has to kind of figure out for themselves, have you been diagnosed? Do you have celiac? Are you gluten intolerant? Do you have that and IBS? Do you just have IBS? And if you're voluntarily going gluten-free, even though you don't have celiac and you do have IBS, you really have to scrutinize labels. You're just going to have to watch them like a hawk.
Okay, so what I get out of what you just explained, I think this is the nuts and bolts to it, in regards to don't assume that if you just go gluten-free, not that you have to, but you're choosing to go gluten-free just to see what happens, definitely pay attention to the labels, because the replacement, when they take the gluten out, those items could be a standard IBS trigger, correct?
Yeah, very likely.
Okay.
Very commonly.
So, okay, great. That is very clear. And if you're listening to this on the recording, go back and listen to this again and again until it sinks in and actually makes sense, because Heather just went right through it, but that's a lot of detail to soak in to help with your directions of managing the IBS. So wonderful.
It's a complicated subject.
Yes.
Gluten intolerance across the board is a complicated subject.
In general, yeah.
You're crossing over, and just in general, and crossing over into wheat. You can have a wheat allergy, but not a gluten intolerance.
Right.
You can be affected by the insoluble fiber, the bran in whole wheat, totally unrelated gluten.
Yep.
You can have a sensitivity to fructans, which are types of short-chain carbohydrates that ferment rapidly. Some people are, have some sensitivities to them. That's in wheat, also unrelated to gluten and insoluble fiber. There's a lot to figure out, a lot of baselines to hit first in terms of getting diagnosed. Do you have celiac? Don't you? And then I would strip out the other possible aggravating factors in wheat before you home in on gluten, because insoluble fiber is definitely going to upset IBS. So whole wheat and bran, universal triggers. Be really cautious with those. Strip those out first. See how you do. If that takes care of the problem, then there's no need to go gluten-free. Fructans, you might have to hunt down with the, fructans individualized, that would be a FODMAPs diet, something you do with a registered dietitian. It takes about 12 weeks. Not everybody who has FODMAPs sensitivities is sensitive to fructan in particular, and then people have different degrees of sensitivities within that, so that's something else to run down. There's a lot to run down when it comes to wheat, gluten, and IBS. Some things cross over, some things don't.
Wonderful. I think we have a question from the comments below. BJ, what's the question?
No, I just think it'd be a good review what Heather means by white bread versus the Wonder Bread and the French and sourdough.
Okay, so again, Heather just went over an immense amount of details on how to approach the question, should you avoid gluten in your diet when you're not diagnosed with celiac? That's what we're speaking about, when you're not diagnosed with celiac. How does it affect somebody who is diagnosed with IBS? And when you go to the word white bread, just because of maybe just a habit, just if anybody out there remembers the 50s, remembers the 60s, remembers the 70s, Heather, I'm holding up a loaf of Wonder Bread. So, and I say
those. Still make it?
I'm sorry?
They still make it?
I know, right? I hate holding it in my hands right now, because you would think by now enough people would realize how there's just nothing beneficial. It's more of but it's old school. It's what used to be the go-to for white bread. I mean, out there, who remembers having a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in grade school, and we all thought nothing of it? Well, things are different now, but when we hear still to this day, when we hear white bread, we automatically, so many of us automatically go to Wonder Bread. So I'm going to put down the Wonder Bread. It's down. It's out of here. And let's talk about what a IBS-friendly white bread is. I have examples here. I'm holding up a sourdough, and I'm holding up a baguette. Those two are your two. To me, I think they're the best breads in the world. That's just, I'm biased about that. But, and Heather explained it on our first IBS and gluten show that we did. But just recap, Heather.
What about French?
The French bread, baguette, and sourdough. They're all a little bit different, but that's the white bread family we're speaking of, yes?
Yes.
Okay.
And I would add on that sometimes people weirdly think that there's things in white breads that are added to them, that they're somehow that's really unhealthy. There's bad things in white bread. But there's nothing in white bread that isn't also in whole wheat bread. There's nothing in white flour that isn't also in whole wheat flour. The difference is what's not there. So if you take whole wheat flour and you sift out the bran, that's the insoluble fiber, you're left with white flour. It's the same exact flour. You've just removed the bran, the insoluble fiber, and that's the only difference. So white bread is the same thing as whole wheat bread, fiber. There's nothing else that should be added to that or that is normally added to that. So if you look at an ingredient list for a good loaf of whole wheat bread, it's going to be whole wheat flour, water, salt, yeast. Ingredient list for a good loaf of white bread, still wheat, but refined flour, is going to be white flour, water, salt, and yeast. The only difference is it's not going to have the bran. But there shouldn't be any other ingredients. They're not adding weird chemicals. You just literally sifted the bran out of whole wheat flour. You're left with white flour, and you make white bread.
So the white bread
simple as that.
Does not have the insoluble flour. Is that correct?
It does not have the insoluble fiber because they've literally sifted the bran out of the whole wheat flour. You can even see the bran in whole wheat flour. Yeah, the bran. Everybody knows bran, wheat bran, all bran cereal. In whole wheat flour, those little brown flecks that you see in a loaf of whole wheat bread, that's the bran. That's the insoluble fiber. And it's staying as little flecks because it's insoluble. It doesn't dissolve in water. So those flecks are never going to disappear. They're going to literally pass through your gut intact and maybe really upset your gut along the way because the bran, the insoluble fiber, is a huge IBS trigger. So take it out. Take it out of the flour. You're left with just white flour. You can make a nice loaf of white bread from that, and that still has all of the soluble fiber. That's in whole wheat. You've just removed the insoluble fiber. For a lot of people with IBS, that's the underlying problem with wheat. It's the insoluble fiber and it's the bran, and it's got nothing to do with gluten. And for a lot of people, nothing to do with fructans. So start with the most likely culprit. Get rid of the bran, get rid of the insoluble fiber. See how you do with that. That may be the only step that you really have to take in terms of wheat and IBS.
I love that step. I love that clarity. And I hope as you're listening to this out there, that you realized, okay, yes, gluten is a lot going on, but Heather just narrowed it down to paying attention to getting rid of what she's always talking about no matter what, but in bread, get rid of the insoluble fiber and see how your body does with it. That's kind of like the first line of defense, would you say, Heather, in the bread world?
Yeah, the first sort of strategy. And for a lot of people, it'll stop there. A lot of people with IBS end up with French bread or sourdough bread as one of their safe staples. Beautiful. A good baguette can be their safe staple. A good bowl of noodles, plain old spaghetti, just plain without a sauce. That's a good soluble fiber staple for a lot of people with IBS.
Beautiful.
So find out if that fits you first before you start stripping out foods unnecessarily.
Wonderful. So that's why I want to read that one email that came in to us, because it really, there's multiple emails that came in very similar, but it was more of a what do I do, what do I do, what do I do, where at least she was demonstrating her pattern, demonstrating her journey of figuring it out. And I wanted to bring that to the light to our show today to let everyone know you can bring light to what's going on with these foundational understanding about gluten and IBS, how we need to separate them. First, look at the insoluble fiber in the flour that you're working with, the wheat. Go from there and then work your way down. But of course, obviously, if you're working with a doctor, being tested, of course, there's always, you're going to know if and like Heather stated, you will know if you have celiac disease. There's no, I love that, because when
you need to know.
When she stated it's iffy, okay, sometimes yes, sometimes no, that's a huge factor. Celiac isn't sometimes, it's a definite. Your body is going to react every time if you have it, right?
Same thing as with a true allergy. If you really have an allergy to something, you're going to react to it.
Right.
It's not going to be sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. Either your body is going to see it as an invader or it's not. So find out if you have celiac. Get the blood test for it. Don't operate in the dark.
Yeah, don't operate in the dark, and don't self-diagnose. Don't assume.
Yes, you can't. You can't self-diagnose celiac. You can't self-diagnose IBS. So you just can't. And a doctor can't diagnose you just by looking at you and listening to you. That's not possible. At a bare minimum, you need some blood work.
And as we've read in the community, when people, their doctor tells them to avoid gluten without doing the diagnose, find a new doctor. You know, Heather just said it. Don't.
Yeah, that's not a good sign.
It's not a good sign.
Yeah. Particularly because if you do then eventually you go gluten-free and then finally figure out you need the test for celiac, you can get a false negative. You have to be eating gluten in order to get that test. So don't
Right.
assume that you need to go gluten-free until you have had a celiac test. You got to be eating gluten for, I think it's at least 6 weeks before that test. So don't get a false negative on that. You want to find
Okay.
out if you have celiac or not.
Wonderful. So Cheryl gave a nice email explaining her situation of what she's working with. She doesn't have celiac, and I'm focusing on the people that do not have celiac. Again, she's going back to some things she responds to, some things don't. So we know, okay, she just has to figure it out. But she does give a testimonial of how the fennel tea is her lifesaver. So when she has eaten too much insoluble fiber and gets the bloating and whatnot, she definitely notices the difference when she is able to manage with the fennel tea. So she just,
Okay.
her
Yeah, that would
question is,
calm things down for sure.
yeah, exactly. So her question is, can you develop celiac if you've been not had celiac disease? Is it something that commonly develops in later in life? That's her question.
Technically, you're born with it. It's a genetic autoimmune disorder. So you either have it or you don't.
Okay.
It can take years to show up. It can take a lot of years past that to be diagnosed. So I would say you may not show symptoms until later in life. That can vary a lot. People do typically start showing symptoms in early childhood.
Okay.
So it would be a little bizarre if you had no symptoms your entire life and then suddenly started having them. But celiac is a chameleon disorder. It can cause skin problems, joint problems, not necessarily gut problems. It's something you just have to be screened for. I would not accept an IBS diagnosis until you know that celiac has been ruled out. Once that has been ruled out, you can be pretty confident in that diagnosis. But, if you have a weird feeling and think something strange is going on and got overlooked and you're an anomaly, make sure you're eating gluten and have the blood test, no matter how old you are. Maybe you just haven't ever been properly diagnosed. That certainly wouldn't be unheard of.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
We say it over and over again. For
celiac you have to.
It's just bottom line is, if anything you hear out of the show today is get the testing and see if you do have it, if you're questioning it.
Yeah.
All the questions I'm pulling up pages of the questions that came in just so the viewers can see. Okay. But I added just those 3 there because those were the nutshell. That was basically every question that came in. It had bits and pieces of those questions there.
Yes.
And so definitely this is a show for you to replay, listen to it over again. Wonderful breakdown. And Heather, you just, it takes a while. We have to read. We have to, we talked about the first thing we need to do with managing IBS is get the education, have an understanding of what's going on. And when you said about the wheat bread and the white bread, what's the difference? Insoluble and soluble. That's the foundation of what an IBS sufferer is dealing with. So that right there, so when you hear the words gluten, be thinking, okay, is it an insoluble, soluble? Have I been tested? And then go down that way versus assuming. Because I think a lot of what I see in the questions that come in, the frustration, and Heather, you've been dealing with so many people through over the years, do they just assume they understand what gluten is and they just kind of follow along without an understanding? Is it just an assumption?
I think so many people with IBS are dealing with, friends and family members who are well-meaning, or they don't have a proper diagnosis from a doctor. So they're struggling. They're trying to find that culprit. What is that thing that's making me sick? And gluten has gotten a lot of press lately. Celiac is finally getting some attention that it deserves. And so that's been sort of misinterpreted as, okay, it's an IBS trigger. But it's not. There's nothing to show that gluten is an IBS trigger at all. There's nothing to show that gluten does any harm to anyone if you don't have celiac. It's not just going to, be a grain protein that somehow magically does damage to you or causes inflammation or causes God knows what. That's not true unless your body is reacting to gluten by producing antibodies. And there's nothing to show that happens if you don't have celiac. And there's nothing to show that happens if you do have IBS. There's nothing inflammatory with IBS. There's no connection between IBS leading to celiac. So these are all different disorders that may or may not overlap, but your baseline with IBS should not be to go gluten-free because there is nothing to support that as helpful.
Okay.
And in the meantime, you are quite likely introducing substitutes for gluten that may well be common IBS triggers.
Yep.
So it's a complex
you just said it perfectly.
area.
Right. And you said it perfectly when about the reader that says they eliminated gluten and noticed a difference. Well, they're eliminating the insoluble fiber. That's where the difference is, even though they're not celiac, right? Would that be?
And also, it could be they eliminated the insoluble fiber, but I don't know what else they eliminated. They eliminated cookies and cakes. Okay, so you just eliminated a lot of high fat and probably high dairy foods as well.
Okay.
That doesn't mean you were reacting to the gluten. God knows what else was in there that you eliminated.
Right.
Also, to truly go gluten-free it's not easy. It's not fun. It's extraordinarily difficult. There's gluten in things you would never suspect. So if you just casually think you're going gluten-free, you're probably not. If you truly had celiac, you'd know it. You would still be intaking gluten. It's hidden in so many things. So going gluten-free, what does that really mean? What did you actually stop eating? I would want details on that.
Right.
Yeah, it's too many other
It's not a
variables
general.
there.
You cannot mask it in a general. Okay, I like that. Well, that helps clarify too.
Yeah, and then if you went gluten-free, what did you add in? I don't know. What are you now eating? I don't know. Right. I just wouldn't start with going gluten-free in terms of your dietary changes for IBS. That's not the baseline one to make.
Okay, definitely. And of course, get tested by a doctor. We can't say it enough.
Yeah. That's the, and then please, a GI doc. You want a celiac blood test? Please, you have to see a gastroenterologist, an internist, or a family doc. You need an MD for that test. This is not some weird test. You have to go to some alternative practitioner. This is a very mainstream gastrointestinal disease type of blood test. And if you have celiac, you will be under the care of a gastroenterologist for the rest of your life.
Yep. Absolutely. And Heather has a portion in her book, First Year IBS. It touches base on that. But again, we're here in the community to help you manage. Rewind this video, play it again until, again, it seeps in there. Have that conversation with your doctor. Anything else, Heather, you can think of before we go ahead and chime out?
You know, in the end, I think it comes down to people trusting your gut. Okay. So if you think that something is hurting you, don't eat it. Even if you don't have a logical explanation, it doesn't matter. There probably is one. So listen to your gut. Conversely, if you think that something is helping you, even if there's no logical apparent reason why, it probably is. So trust your gut on that one as well. For me personally, the very first safe food staple I ever discovered was French bread.
Ooh.
So that was my key from way back before gluten intolerance ever hit the mainstream. I'd never heard of gluten intolerance, never heard of celiac. But I knew the moment I heard of it, well, that's not me, because my safe staple is full of gluten. And I know for a fact it's my safe staple, and I don't care what you say otherwise. I'm going to listen to what my body tells me, and it tells me that this food helps me. So if you are in that position, all that matters is the body you're living with. Trust what it is telling you in terms of whether something is helping you or hurting you. It's all that matters in the end is how you feel.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I hope today's insight, Heather's knowledge, not just her knowledge, but her experience and dealing with so many people. Can't even count the numbers of all the lives you've changed, Heather, helping people manage IBS. There is a link in the down below in the comments. Go ahead and click on that. Of course, First Year IBS and eating for IBS. And do we have time? I'm going to talk to my live cast assistant. Do we have time to show we've talked about IBS gluten. Do we have anything can I show something fun for Christmas real quick?
Oh yeah, next week we're doing a Christmas cooking show.
Oh, next week we'll be airing a Christmas cooking show. So we always want to talk about things you can do and you can enjoy. It's not about what you're eliminating. It's presenting things that you can enjoy while you manage IBS. So stay tuned for that information.
That's right.
Okay, and I have a sneak peek. Heather, I'm going to get a bundt cake that I've made, the peppermint fudge cake. I am showing the camera right now. And my bundt cake is a flower. And so
cool.
It just came out.
Bundt cakes are great. They make it look at fancy, but it's not any more difficult to cook.
No, not at all. I've had the pan forever, but I'm going to add to it because I got so excited. My house smelled amazing. Okay, Heather, right now I'm pulling up, and I just pulled them out of my oven. I made peppermint fudge donuts. Heather's recipe, put it in a silicone donut sheet, and I am showing peppermint fudge donuts. Okay, of course, obviously we're not going to eat all of these, but what a wonderful treat to have. So her recipes, as a professional chef, I can't say enough for the simplicity, the IBS friendliness, but the ease of making them. No equipment, no mechanical equipment necessary. It was just basically a spatula and a bowl. And it's so looking forward to that.
That is a super fast and easy recipe. Yeah, it couldn't be simpler.
No.
And you can bake that as muffins in a loaf pan.
I love it.
You can sprinkle a little powdered sugar over it before serving it if you want to make it look all fancy.
Yes,
but you don't have to. So,
well, also,
and it's a treat. It's a nice treat. So, yeah.
And in your cookbook, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an orange glaze because you have an IBS friendly orange, right? Because peppermint chocolate fudge with the orange glaze, what a wonderful marriage. So I'm going to use your recipe, and I'm going to experiment and see how that comes out.
Oh yeah, that would be good. It's a super flexible recipe.
Great.
And it's a nice indulgence for people, you know, when you feel like you can't eat anything good anymore, everything's going to make you sick. It really can be helpful emotionally to have some sweet treats and to have some special splurges once in a while, and to know that, okay, it's not a health food, it's dessert, but at least it's not going to upset your gut. So you can splurge and have good food and, you know, still stay stable. I think that's important for people with IBS. We need treats too.
Exactly. And the fact, come on, you can have a baguette, especially if you're not celiac. That to me is a splurge to me. So I love that. Well, again, Heather, thank you for taking your time. We know you have a lot going on, but taking time to have this live show. If you do have any questions, of course, leave them in the comments below. Again, thank you for joining us. And until next time, come in here. We're going to help you manage your IBS because you are not alone. Bye-bye.